Good evening, everybody. Thank you all for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you here. As always, I always ask if you could just please silence your cell phones so we could avoid any interruptions here today. My name is Muhammad. I'm the executive director here at the Jerusalem Fund and Palestine Center. And on behalf of our board of directors and staff, it's a great pleasure to welcome you here, including everybody watching online as well. It's also a great honor to introduce and welcome back our distinguished speaker today, Dr. Mazin Qumsiyeh. He was here last year around the same time, and we're very glad to have you. Today he'll be talking about, his talk will be called Mayhem versus Sanity in Western Asia, Why Palestine is Still the Issue. Dr. Qumsiyeh will share his views on the current situation in Palestine now that the peace process has obviously failed, and it's clear that the policies of the U.S. and Israeli governments are failing in Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. He argues that all of these attempts at divide and conquer, media manipulation, and outright distortion of the truth are rooted in consolidating Zionist hegemony over Palestine and beyond. The foreign policy of the United States has become a tool of Israeli colonialism. But he contends we can find some hope in the fact that Trump's more confrontational approach with the world has shattered any illusion that diplomacy and the Oslo track are the method for establishing a Palestinian state. The events surrounding Al-Aqsa mosque, in combination with those in Gaza and the invigoration of the BDS campaign, have reestablished in the minds of most rational people that people power is still where things must be determined. Dr. Qumsiyeh sees this as a promising sign for the future. So just to give you a little bit, for those who don't know a little bit about Dr. Mazin, he teaches and researches at Bethlehem and Birzeit universities. He is founder and director of the Palestine Museum of Natural History, an Institute for Biodiversity and Sustainability. And to learn more about that, you can go to palestinenature.org. He previously served on the faculties of the University of Tennessee, Duke, and Yale universities, and has published over 150 scientific papers on topics ranging from biodiversity to cancer. He was chairman of the Palestinian Center for Rapprochement Between People, and he currently serves on the board of a Rawad Children's Theater Center in Aida refugee camp. His many books include Mammals of the Holy Land, Sharing the Land of Canaan, Human Rights in the Israeli-Palestinian Struggle, which is available in English, Spanish, and German, and Popular Resistance in Palestine, A History of Hope and Empowerment, which is also available in Arabic, English, French, and also soon in Italian. He also has an activism book published electronically on the website Qumsiyeh.org, which is QUMSIYEH.org. And he has published over 250 letters to the editor and 100 op-ed pieces and interviewed on TV and radio extensively, which includes local, national, and international media. One more thing also before we get started, we're going to bring around a sign-up sheet for whoever wants to leave their email for Dr. Qumsiyeh to have, so that if you want to be updated on his activities. So we'll pass that around during the talk, and then afterwards it will be available. So please sign up when you have the chance. Dr. Mazin will speak for about 30 to 40 minutes, and after that we'll have a Q&A session. As always, we ask you that you please wait for the mic to come to you before you ask your question, and that's so that people online can hear. And for the online audience, you can tweet your questions to us to our Twitter account, which is @PalestineCenter. Without further ado, please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Dr. Mazin Qumsiyeh.
Thank you very much for coming. I know it's the last day of Ramadan, and for those celebrating the holiday, Eid Fitr Sa'id. I don't want to, of course I talked last year about different subject. I want to talk today about something that's been on my mind a lot lately with the carnage, especially that's going on in Gaza, that made it fresh in my mind, if you want. Palestinians have paid a very heavy price, of course, since the foundation of the State of Israel. Since 1948, over 100,000 Palestinians have been killed, over 800,000 were injured, and over 700,000 were detained or imprisoned. Just in the past few weeks, as you know, there was over 140 Palestinians who were killed and over 10,000 who were injured, many with live ammunition. Those who were killed in the past few weeks included paramedics like Razan al-Najjar, or quadriplegic like this guy who lost his legs actually in the previous attack in 2014. It included an 8-month-old baby who was suffocated from tear gas. It included press people, included children, etc. These were part of what's called the Great Marches of Return, which are basically attempts by the besieged people of Gaza to demonstrate that they have not forgotten their homes and lands from which they were expelled in 1948. As you know, Gaza is 2 million people imprisoned, open-air prison, and those 2 million people, most of them are refugees. 70% of them are refugees from 1948. And I thought it was kind of interesting what this artist did with his demolished home in Gaza. But also Israel is using these exploding bullets, if you want, which medically is devastating. They shatter bones, they destroy. So many people lost their limbs in Gaza. Actually, I'm attending a National Geographic conference, and I was talking just today to a guy who made a presentation about 3D printers that print the casts for those limbs. So he said we can supply the 3D printer anywhere, and we can just take pictures and then create it. So I said this may be an opportunity for us to cooperate and have him do this in Gaza, because it could help a lot of people who are missing limbs and who don't have artificial limbs like they were here. The other thing that happened since I spoke here a year ago, of course, is this spectacle of Mr. Trump and his cronies basically, quote-unquote, moving the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem. And I don't want to talk too much about it, but it was rightly described as an American-Israeli colony in Jerusalem rather than an embassy in Jerusalem. But ironically, in the picture illustrates what somebody did with Photoshop, because in parallel, the same day they opened this embassy, so to speak, embassy, by Mr. Kushner and Friedman and others who support the colonial system in the West Bank, there was this bloody carnage in Gaza in which 60 people in that day lost their lives. Many things have happened also since I came here a year ago. As you may have heard also, Ahd Tamimi, a friend of mine who I knew her and her family for past 10 years or 12 years. She was actually resisting when she was 9 years old, and now she's in Israeli jail with her brother and with her mother. And the charge for her mother was that basically she videotaped and put things on Facebook, which I considered incitement. And for Ahd, the charge was that she slapped a soldier who was in her yard basically, and just they were shooting at Palestinian children. in Nabi Saleh, and actually one of her relatives, her cousin, got a bullet in his head and he lost like part of his skull. They had to remove and reconfigure, surgery, etc. And she was so affected by this, the fact that her cousin was hit, that she didn't want a soldier shooting from their yard at other children, and that's why she slapped him. But anyway, she's spending time in Israeli jails for this. Lots of things happen in a year, so to speak. And for me, actually, all the things happen are one pile, and this last 2 days have been another pile in terms of emotional pressure on me. And I'll tell you why. Because the last 2 days there were demonstrations in support of Gaza in the West Bank, and these demonstrations were brutally disbanded by the Palestinian Authority. This to me is much worse emotionally than what the Israelis were doing in Gaza, or which is what you expect colonialists to do. You know, they butcher Palestinians. But for us to have the Palestinian Authority act as a Vichy government, and I'm sorry to use harsh terms, but for example, they dressed as civilians. This is all yesterday, by the way. They dressed as civilians and they went in beating and dragging people. Many of them are friends of mine. Sorry. But, you know, and people photographed them, and now we identified them. We know who they are, that they are indeed Palestinian security services who were doing this. These are the people who are trained by the Dayton, you know, the American training of the Palestinian preventive security, as they call it. So, and even high-level Palestinian officials, as this gentleman who you see there meeting with Mahmoud Abbas, were participating in beating and arresting people to try and show off that they are really loyal to Mahmoud Abbas. Of course, you know, what alleviates some of the pain is that there's a lot of international solidarity with Gaza. There's a lot of international caring about Gaza, and it's growing. And as you know, there are ships that are going to Gaza. Next month I'll be on those ships going to Gaza. And these ships, 4 ships that have already toured many ports of call in Europe, their last ports will be in Italy. And people are very sympathetic to the Palestinian cause around the world. And we'll come back to all of this. I'm just explaining very briefly in the beginning kind of things that happened in a year, upon which I want to then build some sort of analysis, which is very tentative, and I hope that you will help me in the question and answer, that we can focus this to see where we are going. In the medical field, we say it's very, you know, you take a patient history, you make a diagnosis, but then the more critical is to apply therapy, of course. You know, what's a therapy? So that's the part that we will talk about together, because I'm not sure I know all the answers. I don't know, you know, tiny fraction of what might be the answers. There are other things happening in the Middle East which you probably also heard about. For example, there were demonstrations in Jordan, both when they moved the embassy, large demonstrations, and also more recently, in the past few weeks, demonstrations about the issues that revolve around the economy in Jordan. Jordan has billions of dollars in debt, and they added 15 billion more in debt by working with Israel to build this canal between the Red Sea and the Dead Sea. I don't know if you heard about that. And this canal is being built on the Jordanian side of the border in Wadi Arab. And the reason it's on the Jordanian side of the border, even though Israel gets most of the benefits, is that it actually leaves Jordan holding the bag of the IMF and World Bank debts of $15 billion for this canal. So the Jordanian public will end up holding this debt. So obviously the World Bank has, like they do in most other countries that they loan money to. There is a book called The Economic Hitman, I don't know if you heard about it, which speaks about how they do these things so that they subjugate third world countries. And so, yeah, you build infrastructure that the country doesn't need, you loan them a lot of money, which they cannot pay back, and then you start to force them to do downsizing. Their public rises up, says, we can't do this, so then you say, okay, we'll give you more money, but then you have to do what we tell you to do. And I think this is part of the plan that Trump and his administration have for Jordan, because they do need Jordan for this deal of the century that they are doing. You heard about the deal of the century, which is to liquidate the Palestinian struggle, leave Israel in hegemony over the Middle East, and the issues of refugees. Refugees don't return to their homes and lands. And this is the plan. These are parts of the demonstrations in Jordan. The other thing that happened last week, for example, was in Afula, hundreds of Israelis demonstrated. What they demonstrated for is the fact that there's one house that was sold to an Arab guy, Arab Israeli, and so they didn't want any Arabs in their neighborhood. This is increasingly happening inside the so-called Israeli state. The other thing that happened in the past year is that the Palestinian Authority also instituted gag orders on things, so that they call, because we don't have a legislator anymore and Abu Mazin was not re-elected, so he's de facto become a dictator. So he issued a law that says any posts on Facebook that they deem offensive will mean that this is a crime. So, and they actually arrested a friend of ours, Isa Amro, for a while. And you can see me here demonstrating with the others about this electronic crime law that Abu Mazin, so-called law that Abu Mazin signed. And of course, you heard that Mr. Trump met with Mr. Kim. Now, why is this also a relevant event? It's because basically, the message that it sends is an amazing message that I couldn't believe that the United States want to send to the world, which is that, it's a dog-eat-dog world, and if you have nuclear weapons, and if you are a threat to the world, we will respect you, will work with you. But if you give up your weapons, or if you don't have them anyway, we can knock you down, kill you, like we did with Saddam Hussein and Libya's Gaddafi. This is the message that's sent out now to every tin-pot dictator around the world. Get your hands on some nuclear weapons, they will really respect you then. There was the wedding of Prince Harry, I guess. One could spin around that if you want, but there is something that we have to really acknowledge, and I'm becoming more and more aware of it, even from outside the United States, and I was aware of it from inside the United States. I lived here for 29 years. And that is the level of disconnect from reality that our leaders have. That our leaders, whoever they are, really think of themselves as somehow, kings of the world. They can move the world, even when they don't have power, like Prince William. They think that they can change the world and that they have a right to change the world to whatever they like. Okay? And this came to mind. We must always think about things, and we must think about things as they are, not as they are said to be by the powers to be, as George Bernard Shaw said. The greatest enemy of knowledge is not ignorance, it is the illusion of knowledge. And we have a lot of illusion of knowledge around us. But now I want to, now I kind of said to you what I've been witnessing in the past year since I came and spoke at this podium last year, in March I think it was. But now I want to think about geopolitics a little bit. And it sounds like a big word and sounds like complicated. It sounds like people like me, who's a biologist, shouldn't even delve in geopolitics because, hell, it's complicated. There's all these players, there's the regional players, international players, etc. But it's really not very difficult to understand the world. The world is rather simple, actually, even though they try to spin it as complicated, but it's really simple. Herzl, for example, is somebody who's, intelligent guy, brilliant guy. I actually wish we have Arab leaders as brilliant as Herzl in terms of organizing and being able to bring people of various backgrounds, leftists, rightists, religious people, non-religious people, atheists, bring them all together under one umbrella and saying, here, let's work for a cause. It doesn't matter what this cause is, but in his case, of course, his case was colonialism, Zionism as colonialism. And he said, a Zionist colony in the Middle East would serve as a rampart for for Europe against Asia, an outpost of civilization against barbarism. Now, by contrast that, I think what the outcome happened is very clear. And a lot of what we saw in the pictures earlier are symptoms, if you want, of this colonialism, right? And they are understandable symptoms. I'm not saying excusable symptoms, but they are understandable in the context of colonialism in the same way that you understand what happened to Native Americans here and the butchery of not only the people, but even their livelihood, like 2 million buffaloes that were killed in the prairies, etc. I think colonialism was actually not such a global phenomena as it is today. This may, again, in the discussion, I hope you will correct me, and I hope we can together come up with a different... I think we have colonialism today to a larger extent than we had it 200 years ago, but I think it's a different kind of colonialism. That's all. It's just metamorphosed into a new type, which is economic colonialism, colonialism by proxies. Instead of having British boots on the ground or American boots on the ground, you have proxy governments like bin Laden or whatever his name is, bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, that's doing the bids of imperialism and colonialism. That's one point I want to make, and I'm not sure you agree with me or not on this, but I think it's an interesting point of departure or discussion. The other thing I want to say is that when, in the past, King Leopold killed however many millions of people in the Congo, it was a local phenomena that nobody really cared about. Nobody even heard about it. Most Europeans are oblivious at the time to what was happening there. Today, colonialism effect is globalized in the sense that we do have a global community. We do have networking. We do have people traveling by airplanes, from one place to another very quickly, except if they are Palestinians like me. It takes me 2.5 days to get here, and then they question me at every airport, etc., and that's another story. But if it's normal, you fly from Tel Aviv to New York, and that's the end of the story, or to Washington, D.C. So what Arnold Toynbee kind of said in 1961, he said this, by the way, he said the tragedy in Palestine is not just a local one. It is a tragedy for the world, because it is an injustice that is a menace to world peace. And I think he was very prophetic in this, that actually it's no longer local conflict. It's not an issue just for Palestine. or for Yemen for that matter, or for Syria. It is now a global issue. Every issue is a global issue. And this probably started in the 20th century with the globalization of the world and easy communications, telephones, fax machines, and most recently emails and internet and Instagram and Facebook and whatever. Things have become interconnected. And South Africa, we saw, for example, how that was a global struggle, not just a struggle for the people of South Africa, it was a struggle for all of us. I was actually involved in this marginally, actually, when I was at the University of Connecticut in 1980. I invited the speaker, who later I found out was a member of ANC, but of course ANC was a terrorist organization at the time, as it was described by Ronald Reagan and just about every Western power there is. This is a globalized struggle also because it started globally. You know, the British and the French were the key to establishing the State of Israel, right? In the form of the Balfour and the Jew-Cambon Declarations, which were parallel declarations in support of the Zionist project. And Balfour actually wrote to his successor in the Foreign Office in 1919, Lord Curzon, saying that basically we don't care whether Zionism right or wrong. We're not interested in that. We just know that this is good for us, for the empire, basically. And so we supported it. So the words he used, it's of far profounder import to us than the wishes and the whims and biases or whatever of the local people. That's the words he used. Churchill. Churchill was a typical imperialist. He was a racist to the core, by the way. One of the worst war criminals in history, not a war hero, as I like to give him credit for. And this is, for example, a quote from Churchill in October 1941, which is also prophetic in many ways, is that, after the war, what we will do is create a Jewish state, which will bring in millions of Jews to live in that state, and this will be good also for the empire. There are many examples of this. I want to just go through a few examples of how this is all connected globally in the 20th century, especially with respect to Palestine. After career diplomats in 1930 issued a government-backed white paper suggesting tying Jewish immigration to Palestine to Palestinian economic conditions or interests at the time, and not just to whatever the Yishuv told them to do, the local Zionist organizations, basically. And the reason, by the way, they came up with this white paper is because there was an uprising just before that, 1929, which was uprising number 5, Intifada number 5. We had, by the way, 14 intifadas or uprisings. The first Intifada was not 1987, was 1881, if you want, which was actually successful. But anyway, that's another story. But when they did issue the white paper in response to the pressure from the local people, Weizmann and other Zionists pressured the British government, told them, hey, what are you doing? You forgot about the Sykes-Picot and the Balfour and Jules-Cambon declarations. And so the British had to step back from it. This is, by the way, also something that I had debates sometimes with some people in America about, including Noam Chomsky, about, the tail wagging the dog or the dog wagging the tail, so to speak. I think, we have to acknowledge certain facts about this that can be investigated by anybody, really, about the power of the Zionist lobby in Washington, for example, and how it influences and shapes U.S. foreign policy, and not that Israel, as Chomsky said, is like a U.S. Land-based airplane carrier or something to that effect. No, I'm sorry. Israel has more power in Washington than Donald Trump has. When there was a strong sentiment in the US, for example, to help European Jews in 1939, 1940, 1941, the Zionist lobby in Washington actually lobbied to close the door against Jewish immigration because they wanted all Jews to go just to Palestine. They wanted that. And they succeeded, even before AIPAC was founded. You know, Truman, why did Truman support the partition of Palestine, the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine? He said it very clearly in front of his cabinet. All of them were against it, by the way, including all the intelligence services in the US, the predecessor of the CIA at the time. All of them were against it, but Truman said, well, I have to do it. And he said in a meeting of these cabinet ministers at the time, gentlemen, and they were all men, of course, white men, gentlemen, you know, I don't have a large Arab constituency who's going to make me a president. He was going to run for president. When when Israel just about, now, what are we now? 51 years later, but it is the last week was an anniversary of the attack on the USS Liberty and killing of Navy men on that ship in international water, intentionally, by the way, and everybody on that ship swore that this was intentional. And of course, it was swept under the carpet. So why is it swept under the carpet if it is really the dog wagging the tail, so to speak? You know, we have a slew, and I don't have to tell you this, you know about these things. We have a slew of international figures, important people like Dennis Ross and Martin Indyk and others who basically worked as lobbyists for the State of Israel and then became significant officials in the administration. Martin Indyk was actually an Australian guy. He came here and they speeded up his immigration papers so that they can appoint him as ambassador to Israel. There's things like Paul Wolfowitz, Dick Cheney, and Douglas Faith, and others, and neoconservatives, and how they pushed for the war in Iraq. You can read the book by Mearsheimer and Walt, for example, about why we ended up in Iraq. It wasn't because of oil or because of weapons of mass destruction or terrorism or anything like that. It was because of Israel. This is the reality that we have to acknowledge. A war that cost us, American taxpayers, $3 trillion. There's actually a Harvard economist who wrote a book about this called, title of the book is The $3 Trillion War. And the US has $21 trillion in debt, of which $9 trillion, to be precise, $9 trillion are due to our wars on the Middle East, on the people of the Middle East, that are done on the behest of Israel, whether it's in Syria and Iraq, in Afghanistan, or in Yemen now. This letter I kind of dug up because I think it's relevant to our questions here. You know, and I say our founding fathers because I'm an American citizen also, our founding fathers like Jefferson were actually very insightful about some things that could happen and would happen. And I think this letter that's sent by Jefferson to a rabbi who invited him to basically cut the ribbon on opening the synagogue, it said it all. It says basically, you know, nice that you told me about all the suffering of Jews around the world, etc. But, you know, it confirms in my mind what actually happens is that any sect, if you put it in charge, you know, it will cause suffering for other people. So we were trying here, and he's admitting that they are not succeeding at it. It takes some time. We're trying to remedy this via laws. And I think that's very, very prophetic, again, of Thomas Jefferson. The other thing we have to think about is that politics and economy are interconnected. And these demonstrations in Jordan, as I showed you earlier, illustrate this. That you cannot isolate economy from politics. This is the supposed average GDP per capita in different Arab states. Oil-rich states like in the Gulf region, you can see the average per capita is what is given. For example, Qatar is the highest, and then you have United Arab Emirates followed by the others, like Kuwait, etc. But this is not the real picture. The real picture is, of course, the disparity between this. When we say the average is, for example, 68,000, doesn't mean that, many people make 68,000. Actually, they either make millions and billions, or they make zero. Saudi Arabia actually is one of the poorest number of poor people in Saudi Arabia. It is huge. People are literally walking around in the desert like they did 1,500 years ago. They are desperately poor. And of course, you have people like, again, what's his name, the guy? That's in charge, has billions and billions of dollars. And these guys, they take the money of these countries and they give them as they wish. For example, this guy, he sat down with Trump. Well, Trump very insultingly, sitting with him and saying, look what this guy gave us for nothing. Here's billions here, billions there, billions there. He had even a chart in front of him. I mean, it's almost like a doctored picture, but it's an actual picture. It's unbelievable. And they have the chutzpah, if I may use that word, to say that they are Arabs, when they are actually killing people in Yemen, for example, starving people, children in Yemen. This to me is amazing, that we allow such spectacle to go on in our part of the world. Now I want to switch a little bit again. You'd have to excuse me for this presentation because I want to kind of give what you call all the symptoms of the problems of humanity, and then towards the end, I want, with your help, to try and arrive at something rather coherent or logical. We face unprecedented dangers today. And when I mentioned that before, colonialism or even genocide, as happened in Congo, were localized phenomena, today there's no localized phenomena. Because, for example, pushing the issue of Iran or North Korea and all of this stuff could end up in nuclear war, by the way, which is, the scientists who are putting that clock, if you remember, they're saying like we are 2 minutes to midnight. We as a species could begun, or at least as organized human societies, we may go back to being, foragers and hunters, foragers, whatever. And we may be having forced to eat roaches because they will survive and proliferate after nuclear war. So a nuclear war could devastate the human society. But also the environmental issue, which I don't have time to go into, but it's my passion as a biologist, speak about climate change and what's happening and all of this stuff. These two dangers, global climate change and global nuclear war, could end Homo sapiens as an organized, quote-unquote, civilization, although I may debate with you whether we are civilized or not yet. But anyways, I put the slide about biodiversity. So now we need to push that button call to action, because if we don't do that, if we don't think what is our role and how are we going to affect this transformation to go back to a level of sanity so that we don't have people like Netanyahu and Abu Mazin and Trump heading our affairs, we are in trouble, not just as local communities here in America or in Palestine or in Israel or whatever, but as a species we have problem. And I think we have to really start to appreciate the level of the danger that we face. I put this picture because it illustrates human diversity. And human diversity is a strength for us. The fact that we have people who work for human justice around the world, and even at the National Geographic, by the way, headquarters, where I'm attending this Explorer Symposium, I can tell there is a disparity between those in power at the institution and the people who are doing a lot of the work. What do I mean by that? Even when I registered, by the way, for National Geographic Explorer community, I scrolled down to put my country. There's nothing there. Doesn't have Palestine, doesn't have West Bank and Gaza. I looked under O for occupied Palestinian territory. There's nothing. So what am I going to do? You know, and I'm still struggling with them. Hopefully they can change that. But on the other hand, I'm talking to people there, you know, from all corners of the world, Indonesia, Malaysia, Kenya, who are doing amazing work, local work that really makes a difference in the lives of common people. But these are people who don't have the power. So this is the other part of the conundrum which I want us to think about, is the people who are doing the good work are not the people who are in power. And the people who are in power are the ones who are doing more damage than they are doing good. How do we remedy this? How do we, you know, and I was actually met with Ralph Nader, and Claire Nader is here, and we talked yesterday. And he gave me his book about power, and I was reading in it, and it's a remarkable little book because it was, you know, explaining that there are times in human history when indeed there was effective power. And if you think about it, even in American history, what are the positive things that happened to us here as Americans? And how did we get those things? You know, right of women to vote, civil rights, ending the war in Vietnam, 40-hour work week, workman safety, highway safety, using even car seat belts, which Ralph Nader was key in doing that. All of these things happened to us because, you know, these little people, if you want, got together and said, there's something, something not quite right, we have to fix it. Now, we are in 4.5 billion years of Earth history, a beautiful planet, by the way, and we humans are in the past 8,000 years, which is nothing in world history. And humans could, as I said, could go and, okay, you know, dinosaurs also went. So Earth, I'm not worried about Earth. Earth will survive us, with us or without us, Earth will go on. But I do care about human species because I'm part of it and we want to do something different, right? So here comes what I consider part of the solution, which is resistance. And I like this figure, even though I don't know where I got it from. It's not mine. But anyways, it talks about becoming more human in the sense of becoming more connected to our needs and our society and how we connect to this. And we have to also be optimistic because nothing stays the same. Trump will be gone one way or the other. Netanyahu will be gone. All of these things will change. Nothing stays the same. And I take solace from the hopes of people like Arundhati Roy, who said that another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing. And, you know, things like that. Like Martin Luther King, what he said is, you know, people need to act, basically. And Frederick Douglass, for example, said, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. I would like someday, when I meet Abu Mazin, is to give him this quote in Arabic. You know, it doesn't happen by going to them and begging for the morsels of giving us a state, you know. So And to end, I like, my wife is Chinese American, so I like Chinese proverbs. To know and not to do is not to know. Better to light a candle than curse the darkness. I hear and I forget, I see and I remember, I do and I understand. And for us Palestinians, doing things on the ground is the best school. So when politicians say, what's to do? I say, go down to the street. Go down, demonstrate with us. Go down, get arrested with us. And yesterday I spoke at Plymouth Church, and the Reverend Hagler was actually just arrested in the Poor People's March. So I want to kind of leave you with the question, and for us to discuss it together. I want to hear your opinion about how we collectively can move together to a better world. Because ultimately we don't have much of a choice. We either, as I said, either as a species we fail, or as a species we succeed. There's no winners and losers in the conflicts that are happening today. I'm sorry, Saudi Arabia is not going to win the war on Yemen, or the Yemeni resistance going to win over Saudi hegemony. Wars are lose-lose, and lose-lose scenarios that are getting more and more devastating, because wars 200 years ago, 80, 90, 95% of the victims, of the ones who lose their lives, were the soldiers fighting it. Today, less than 1% of those who are fighting the war are soldiers, who are victims of wars are the soldiers. The remainder are civilians. That's who pays the price. So we cannot, and even soldiers, by the way, they pay a much heavier price also now, because of the way the wars are fought and because of the way they see the wars are being fought. So the biggest killer of American soldiers now, do you know what? Suicide. 22 a day are committing suicide. So, you know, it's amazing. So anyway, I'll stop here, and I want to thank you for your attention, and I hope you signed the email list that we passed around, and I'm happy to talk about any subject you want, because I'm not, you know. Thank you.
Dr. Mazin, thank you so much for a great presentation. Thank you. So now we'll take some questions. Again, please just wait for the mic to come to you before you begin. So let's start with that.
Hi, Dan Libet. Hi, Mazin. You know, I have a website, Alternative Insight. I think you distributed quite a few of the articles. And I want to get back to your redefinition of colonialism. I did write an article, I don't know if you read it, called The New Puritans. And in it, I try to relate Israel as being the new Puritans. And the reason is the Puritans, they came because of supposedly religious persecution, but they really came under the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and they had to establish industry and commerce here in return. And of course, in the early years, they were welcomed by the native population and managed to then extinguish the native population. And that really set the stage, actually, for the total extinguishing of the Native American population. And I think that sort of has a parallel, you know, to the present excursion of the Zionists into, you know, to that area of Palestine. So I want to think what you think of that comparison.
Okay. Do you want me to answer that, or? You know, I just wrote, you know, a couple of chapters in books that are coming up on colonial and post-colonial history, and trying to analyze things. You know, most of the world was either colonized or colonizer. Maybe Switzerland was the only country that has never been colonized. Maybe it was, I don't remember. But anyways, most countries had the history of colonization and or being colonized, sometimes both, like Spain. And but they were, as I said, kind of local phenomena in the past. Nowadays, with the transformation of colonialism to this neoliberal colonialism with the World Bank and the economic hegemony and the impoverishment of places like Gaza and most countries in Africa, for example. Colonialism has become this global phenomenon, and I think the response to it is similar to the majority of the response that happened to colonialism in the past, which is resistance that leads to what? For most countries, 98% of the countries that were colonized, it leads to one country for all its people. I wrote a book about the subject with regards to Palestine called Sharing the Land of Canaan. So if you look at South America, Central America, Caribbean islands, all of these countries, Canada, etc., there's an integration of the colonial with the colonized people into one country. Not a perfect solution, but it's okay. It's better than the other two scenarios, which I won't go into. One is the Algerian model, and one is the genocide model, like happened in Australia and the United States. But the point of coexistence in the context of post-colonial struggle, we have to think of it now in terms of how do we deal with this. I mean, the colonial idea has to be dropped, clearly. Colonial idea was dropped in Brazil or Argentina or Chile or any of these things. So the colonial idea of the economic colonialism and the hegemony that is there has to be dropped. But then we can live together. Then we can talk about living together. But this time, instead of in local nation states or whatever, we're talking about at the global level on this blue planet, that we have to live together in somewhat of an equality. That's how I'm looking at it. Clearly, you cannot continue to have this disparity of wealth or disparity of power. And clearly, we cannot have people like, Bloomberg becoming mayor of New York because he has billions of dollars, or Trump becoming president because he's very rich. So things have to change. My question is to all of you is what's the best mechanism? I mean, some of it is what we are doing, but what else am I missing here? What else can be done?
My name's David Schwartzman. I really appreciate how you concluded your talk by addressing the global challenges, particularly biodiversity and climate change. And I'm going to try to partially address the question you just posed. Actually, I wrote a short essay for iJan ebook several years ago, and it was entitled "The Path to Climate Security Passes Through Gaza." And I think that what it's suggesting is that the movements, the peace movement, the anti-imperialist movement, the climate justice movement, have to really connect and converge. The movement for BDS, I think, needs to be supported by the climate justice movement, because unless the imperialism is defeated in the Middle East, we will not have the regime globally of cooperation that you are putting forward, because we won't have the cooperation to prevent climate catastrophe. In particular, we actually need oil to do away with itself, because it has the lowest carbon footprint of the fossil fuels. So countries in the Middle East can play a role along with other oil-producing countries, and that's my partial answer to your question. And I do have a question though. In terms of the role, this imperial axis in the Middle East, led by the U.S. and NATO, which includes Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and Israel, and I would like you to address the more detail, the way that Israel and Saudi Arabia apparently have been cooperating lately.
I mean, You know that Saudi Arabia was just defeated in the football game with Russia 5-1, 5-0. And the Arab world was actually cheering for Russia. So, but the ironic thing is that the Israeli government, they have Facebook and stuff in Arabic, and before the game they put a very nice encouragement, and they said our team. This is the word they used, our team, about the Saudi team. Imagine Israel is saying about the Saudi football team that it's their team, that in Arabic, you know, تشجيع منتخبنا الوطني, or something to that effect. Yeah, so it's hard to describe the level of cooperation between the Saud family and the Zionist project. You'd have to go back actually to 1917 or something, or before that, even 1914. When the ruler, Al Saud, the ruler, was a tin-pot, tribal chief from a small tribe, not the largest tribe in Saudi Arabia, or what's now called Saudi Arabia, but then Hijaz and Arabia. He was put in power actually by the British. And as a quid pro quo, they said you'd have to accept the Zionist project. And then there was the Weizmann, who was it, that Faisal Weizmann discussions also about things and the support of the Zionists. But Al Saud himself even wrote in his own handwriting. He was not very literate, by the way. There's an Arabic version of it. The Arabic that he wrote, basically saying that to Percy Cox, who was in charge then at the time, Percy Cox said, "Do you support Zionism or not? If you really want our support, you need to support Zionism." He said, "Well, I do." He said, "Write it down." So he wrote down in his writing, "I will support the poor Jews of the world coming to Palestine as the wishes of Her Highness and represented by Percy Cox, whatever. And I will do so, and we will do so till the end of times," or something like that in Arabic. Yes, there is a relationship that is a sick relationship of power. I remember the first time I heard a real Zionist leader speak in front of me in person was at the university in Connecticut when I didn't remember his name now, but he came and he was speaking about things, and he was pretty honest. He was like an old gentleman in his 70s, and he really reached a point where he said whatever he felt like it. And he said something to this effect. He said, "We Zionists love dictators." This is word for word what he said. I remember it. He said, "We love dictators." Why? Because it's one person you have to deal with. And you can easily move these dictators. That's it. And so Zionism has always been interested in promoting dictatorships in the Middle East and not in promoting democracy. And whenever you had any kind of challenge to Zionism, it's very easy. You change. Like, CIA also was participant in this with the Mossadegh government in Iran, for example, in the 1950s, when they put the Shah of Iran, who was friendly to Israel and had close working relationships. In Egypt, what happened with Mubarak and subsequent things and putting the Sisi in power, etc. We have a problem in this, but I think it's not an excuse to say, okay, the powers to be appoint dictators. It is our responsibility to challenge them. And challenging them, you pay a price for it. By the way, I have been arrested by Israel over 12 times, maybe 15 times, I lose track. But I was also questioned by the American authorities many times, and also by Jordan security services once, and also by the Palestinian Authority once. So there's 4 governments that don't like me. Go figure. I'm a nice guy. I don't know why they don't like me.
Thank you. Every time I come to an event like this, I ask the same question, hoping I'll get a different answer. Do you see any hope for change within Israel itself?
Well, I mean, first, I don't recognize Israel, by the way. I consider it still occupied Palestine, the Israeli regime, if you want. But anyways, the Israeli public, yes. When I was arrested, I told you more than a dozen times. Half the times I was arrested with Israeli citizens. So that's a hopeful sign that there are some people willing to put their lives on the line with us, even though they don't face the same risks as we do. That's still a positive sign, and I think that's important. But you have to define what you mean by hope for the Israelis. Is there hope for the Americans? Yeah. Public, I don't know. I mean, there are Americans who are doing good work, and there are Americans who don't give it, Apathy is the biggest human illness, by the way. Not evil deeds that are done by a few usually, like Trump or whatever, or Obama for that matter. But the apathy is the lack of interest from the majority of the public. If we can get 1 or 2% of the public to act on things, that's sometimes sufficient to make a change. And that's what we have to focus on, is that small minority that makes a difference, not the majority. The majority of Israelis will always be apathetic. The majority of Palestinians will always be apathetic. The question is, how do we get this small minority to grow, that 0.1% that makes a difference, or 0.2%, or whatever it is. And this is something that's not very easy to answer.
Hi, I'm Pam. I'm with the We Are Not Numbers, the organization. I think
Sorry?
We Are Not Numbers. It's a project for youth in Gaza that writes stories. So there's actually debate within Gaza itself right now about the Great March, the Great Return March, that is still sort of going on. I'm sort of curious, because of your past book on the history of nonviolence among Palestinians, how you regard that event, because some people would argue that it has achieved quite a bit because there's actually been a pretty amazing amount of, I would say, positive press coverage for Palestinians in light of and other people would point to the loss of life, a huge loss of life. And what I'm hearing from my friends there is you just walk around the streets now and the number of people on crutches, et cetera, is like really depressing. So how do you perceive, in light of nonviolent history, how do you perceive that event, and whether it's been effective or not effective, or should that kind of approach be used?
Well, I might say that as a scientist, I describe things as they are now, and not wishful thinking. Nobody is really organizes civil rights, for example. Here, it was not like organized from some top-down approach. It was just a common people engaged, and there were people who are engaged in one form of resistance for Jim Crow laws, and others who were engaged in other kinds of resistance. There were the Malcolm X's of the world. There was the Martin Luther Kings of the world. And of course, for me personally, if you ask me what kind of resistance do you do, I can tell you what I do. But that is not necessarily what I want to project, that everybody should do what I'm doing. In fact, that is like silly. It doesn't happen in history, never happened in history. Always you have a spectrum of different forms of resistance and different types of resistance, and people engage in them because of their background being different. My background is different than the background of somebody in Gaza in a refugee camp. So I cannot lecture them about types of resistance or what they should do or should not do. And we should never try to do that, because that's also a form of, elitism, and what Edward Said called Orientalism is a form of trying to project our own whatever image we have about the world to other people and force them to do what we are doing. So with that said, I think every action is good. There is no action that's not good. Because as I said just for the question before that, the issue of apathy for me is more dangerous than anything else. And everybody acknowledges this, everybody who's thoughtful knows this. Even Mahatma Gandhi once said, if I had the choice between doing nothing and engaging in violent resistance, I would choose violent resistance. Because apathy is worse. So any action is on the ground is a critical and important component, and it changes the dynamics. Apathy is really what caused things like what happened in the Second World War and what happened with many, many situations. You know, why did we have slavery stayed so long with humanity? Because of apathy. Why did we have the civil rights only 100 years after, after the Civil War? Because of apathy. Most people just didn't care, including the victims, by the way. The victims also had the majority who were apathetic. And we as victims should start to just act. And that's the best, to me, the best school for life is the street. So I say, I tell my students, forget everything I teach you at the university. If you want to learn about life, go live it. Go do it. That's the best teacher, is to go to the poor people, work with the poor people, go to the disenfranchised people. Part of the reason why I left Yale, by the way, after 5 years at Yale, is because Yale was an elite society which told its students and its doctors and its professors, don't walk across that road to go to the to the other neighborhood, the inner city, because it's dangerous. And this is, to me, is like, what are you talking about? How is the society going to evolve if we have, the psychological barriers that they impose on us? So that, to me, is a key factor, is to actually immerse yourself in the society and do something, regardless of what it is that you do. There is more. Oh.
I have, Ann Lyko, and I have more of a comment question. Just trying to figure out on how you bring together all the work that you've done and people, about what's happening to us globally and in terms of the environment and in terms of our long-term future as a species, and looking at what's happening politically, whether it's here or whether it's in Palestine or Israel or Saudi Arabia or whatever. And I keep thinking about a book I read a long time ago by Howard K. Smith called Last Train from Berlin, which was about Nazi Germany. And he has a very polemic chapter at the end where he talks about, as a young cub reporter, and this is 1943, looking at what he called political democracy and economic democracy, and how the corporate and businesses, large businesses in Germany, were basically the collaborators with Hitler and made Hitler possible, and the devil's bargain that was made between arming the Nazis in the war and everything, and making them all rich. And we see the same issues here and all over the world, the folks with all the money and increasing inequality of wealth, and so much of it in these global corporations and all the rest, and the regular people being more and more impoverished no matter where you look around the world, and trying to think about the places where better things are happening are, as you describe, at the local level where people getting together to do things, but how do we take that to a larger scale to encompass whether it's nation states or the globe as a whole? And I'm not quite sure, how we should start thinking about how do we bring a better life for everybody and preserve our earth and our environment and our capacity at the same time.
Yeah, I mean,
deconstructed this small number of people controlling almost everything and leaving just destruction in their wake.
as I said, I don't have the answers to such larger questions. I know for me personally, I have shifted the way I act in different directions. For example, I used to participate a lot more in the actual trying to organize demonstrations, and then I decided to organize demonstrations. You need a lot more people. To get a lot more people, you need to shape the way they think about the world. So that's why we started this Museum of Natural History, which, by the way, I have brochures about for these people who are interested, with the explicit idea of shaping the views of children and changing the way children behave, not teaching them, but creating an environment where they learn to respect themselves, number one, respect other people, number two, and then respect nature, animals and plants, number three. I think these three levels of respect are sufficient to address our global problems if we get enough people coalesced around them. At least this is how I think now, and for the past 4 years when I focused on this project. Doesn't mean that in a year or two I may be doing something else, that also does accomplish the same thing. I mean, we all want the same end, which is what you described. We want an earth that's sustainable, a planet that's sustainable, a community that is not at war with each other, human community. This is what we want, and we want not this huge disparity of power. I think we all agree to that. I think there's actually a vast majority of the people who agree to that. The question is how to get there, and it starts with the human minds, so we really need to change the way we think, and we start with ourselves, of course. I start with myself, and by embracing, I don't have to go, head on and hit the other guy because he's oppressing me. No, I welcome him. Come, let's talk about your problem. Why do you have a problem? What is the issue? Let's talk. I mean, the other day at the museum, I got 55 Israelis who came to hear from me. One of them is a wife of a current minister in the Israeli government, and she was open-minded enough to hear from me. She didn't like some of the things I said, but it was good. And I think, slowly we reach out, and there are thousands of people who come and visit us in Bethlehem, for example. I welcome you to come and visit if you haven't been there. It's transformative when you see things on the ground, when you go out and see places like Al-Walaja and the refugee camps and things like that. So it's just, I want people to be immersed in the experience of being human. And this is, it's not easy, but sometimes they are kicking and screaming to avoid being there because they have their comfort zone as privileged, society, whatever. And the same with many Palestinians, by the way. I mean, I showed you pictures of this guy who's, strong guy, big guy, security for the Palestinian Authority, was dragging somebody. It was a peaceful demonstration, dragging him on the ground, literally. To me, that person is not an enemy, is still a human being. I need to talk to him. I need to figure out what his problem is and why is he doing this. Is it because of financial insecurity? What exactly does he want? And I sometimes get to them, by the way, through their children, but that's another story. So anyways.
Hi, I'd just like to say that there are some things going on in the US right now politically that do make me much more hopeful about the Palestinian conflict. Last year in 2017, Representative Betty McCollum introduced the first ever pro-Palestine legislation in the United States Congress. And according to Pew Research, over the past couple of decades, Americans, especially young Americans, have become a lot more pro-Palestine than they have been in the past. And research also shows that the more that people know about what's actually going on in Palestine, the more likely they are to be pro-Palestinian. And you kind of touched on this in your last answer, but I would just like to know if you or anybody in this room has any strategies that have been successful for you to reach out to other people and bring people to the table and try to get them to listen and possibly come around. Because I do think that if there becomes a consensus in America to stand up for Palestinian human rights, the rest of the world would probably follow suit.
Yeah, between 2000 and 2005, we had something called the Wheels of Justice bus tour, which toured around the United States, traveled to 48 states. We spoke at 1,200 colleges and universities. We spoke at over 300 schools, middle schools, high schools. I was one of the organizers, and I also spoke on the bus so many times that I actually did travel to 48 states. And it was remarkable to see the level of reception for the truth among common people. We spoke at churches, we spoke at mosques, we even spoke at 2 synagogues, and we even spoke at the Naval College. And the reception is remarkably positive. Things do change if you tell the truth to people, if you are honest, if you clearly don't have an agenda of enriching yourself or whatever, people are responding. And they respond because the truth is so obvious, and the danger to us and to Americans, is so high by continuing this road that most people see it. September 11, by the way, when I was here when September 11 happened, I was like 40 minutes away in my house from New York. And immediately after that, there's negative things, there's positive things. Of course, negative things, we were harassed like hell. And they went after me, and email spams and other things, and even death threats, etc. But the positive thing is that I started receiving calls. People want to hear from us. What is going on? Why did this happen? How did it happen? What's the issues of the Middle East? And people started getting awakened to a reality that was hidden from them by the mainstream media and by Hollywood, which was just vilifying Muslims, etc., as Jack Shaheen, explained beautifully. So I think there is a lot of potential for action. And people, common people, like you and I mean, I'm not a politician. I was never trained in public media things. But I do succeed partly because you educate yourself, you tell the truth, and people are receptive to this because they see its connection to them. And I think that's how we need to speak to people, honestly and truthfully, and not with an agenda of I hate Israelis or I hate this or I don't hate anybody. I love all people. Come, let's live together. What's the problem? Let's figure out why do you have a problem with me as a Palestinian? My family is Christian. Why is it I'm not allowed to live in Palestine or a Palestinian Muslim? Well, what is the problem that they have? And so when you bring up the truth, you can bring people around, and you can do it now with the mass media much more successfully than, let's say, 100 years ago, of course. You can do a lot more. The email list, by the way, that you guys just signed, I have over 51,000 now on it. 51,000 people receive my emails every week. So anybody can do what I did. It's just a matter of, focusing energy, telling people, collecting emails, reaching out through Facebook, Instagram, all this stuff. So there are many ways to do this. Just have to spend effort.
Yeah, I think we have time for one more question. I think
Thank you. My name is Salim Miqdadi. I have heard a lot of things today, particularly apathy. And I want to ask you with regard to apathy and whether, in your opinion, apathy ends when you reach a point you have nothing to lose, particularly the people of Gaza and now maybe to some extent the people in the West Bank. Are we now watching a phenomena that what happened in Gaza might creep in the West Bank with the corruption of the Palestinian Authority and the people, in maybe not in Ramallah, but outskirts of Ramallah and other towns in the West Bank feel like they really have to take matters in their own hands, using non-violent resistance and maybe civil disobedience like we had in 1987?
I mean, I am hesitant to give an answer yes or no on this because it's sort of kind of in the middle. Because if you look at 1987 uprising, the economy was doing very well. People were having employment inside Israel with good salaries, everything. It was not a desperate situation, yet there was an uprising that was one of the most successful uprisings that we've had since the 1936 uprising. And the same with the 1936 uprising, by the way. The economy was just fine at the time. The British were there and the economy was flourishing. So it is not necessarily a sense of desperation that drives people to act. I think there's something more to it than that. I think it has to do with the sense of awareness of your power to affect a change in your own circumstances. And this is a much more difficult thing to analyze, which has to do with mental colonization, which I kind of alluded to earlier a little bit. I actually wrote a chapter about this in a book that is coming out on colonialism called Psychological Colonization, basically, which I speak about how people sometimes need to understand that their mind is the key, not their body, not the physical deprivations and difficulties and the walls and so forth. I mean, I, as a Palestinian, for example, I'm not allowed to Jerusalem. Even with my American passport, I'm not allowed to Jerusalem because my family is Christian and we live in the West Bank. But I do go to Jerusalem every month. I smuggle myself in. Why isn't the other Palestinians doing what I'm doing? You know? Okay, there's some risk to it, but still, it is doable. So I think it has to do with this freedom of decision, freedom of choice, that people need to understand that they do have that freedom and that the freedom is here, not out there, that they have to grab it. So mental freedom is more important, and I wish that I figure out a way that I can reach out to more people, explain to them that they do have that power to change their own circumstance, because that's what leads to a revolution and leads to changing our circumstance and leads to going from that 1% to 2%. That could be the key factor in everything. I want to thank you for hosting me and come visit us in Palestine.
Thank you, Dr. Mazin. Thank you so much.
And if you haven't signed the email list, sign the email list.
Yeah, please
My
sign
cards are here and the brochure for the museum is here. The museum is tax deductible. If you want to make donations, we welcome it. Thank you.